So the Bill Reid Gallery is very honored to be situated in the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. We are a gallery of Northwest Coast art, so we are speaking and presenting both the art of Bill Reid and then his legacy, his inspiration on all the other artists of the Northwest Coast. This year is the 100th birthday of Bill Reid. Bill Reid, please do come in. Hi guys. This is our Bill Reid's 100th birthday, and so this show, To Speak with a Golden Voice, is a special exhibition that is featuring Bill Reid and his legacy. So without further ado, I will introduce Khelsilem and Salia Joseph. Thank you so much. Try it.
Tanoia and Safaital Tea Seeds, Tanoia CA, Exeo Hutchit, and name it was Squamish, Shitwat to A, to Mail, I mean, and Slate went to Clement Tanoia, which was Ois to Lam, A to Mail, and the nation source to Mail to Squamish Board, Stalmoch, A to Homans William or Stalmoch, A to Salia or Stalmoch, and Khelsilem, it's Chalton. Do you know what a mod, what a shade to Kammalai, 80 and Kupa, and then do you know what for Elsh as O, Clan Aish, and then Hatches Quawins, Quistchit, Hamainty seeds, a Toktatane Mechanics of the Snation, and then the Source states up, and then Jin Esquafak. Quince wat took natch out took Nate Shan Irish T6 and then Chin Satan T Sat took Nam Shan Irish for nature main Tomiano.
Asien. Tanoia Verquato, Salia Joseph, Kuyan Snas, Tehalo, Kuyan Shamli, and Hatton Squall and Quins with Ash 8 days. Tanoia T-Seeds, Hat Quisnation, Tanaish, Hatton Squallin, Quins, Quick Oyster, Escotano T-Seeds, Hatton Squallin, Quins were Quachnomia T-Seeds, Chinquamantomi, Elktons, Hamchit, Hatton Squallin.
Hello everybody. Really want to welcome each and every one of you here today. Just shared a few words of blessing and welcome and introduction in our language of the Squamish people, and really want to thank the organizers for inviting us to be here, but also really wanting to welcome you all here to our territory here in Vancouver. Shared territory between the Musqueam people, the Squamish people, and the Tsleil-Waututh people who have lived in this land for many thousands of years as relatives, as sibling nations to each other. We come from the Squamish nation, but with many family connections to our neighbors in this territory and many shared histories of utilization of this land, of living together, of being together, and lots of ancestral connections and cultural connections as well. And just wanted to say that I'm really happy and really glad in my heart to be here to talk about the return of our language over the last few decades and century, but also the work that's coming because of, I think, the strength of our young people to take on that challenge and the determination of our ancestors and our elders to make sure that we could do this work because they sacrificed so much for us. But just really glad to welcome you all here. We're going to share a few songs to welcome you, and and then we're going to get into the discussion.
Tanoia. My name is Salia Joseph, and my ancestral name is Tehalo. Thank you, Khelsilem, for agreeing to come speak with me today. Jordy approached me a little while ago, asked me if I wanted to share some thoughts on language revitalization, and then I asked him to come and chat with me. So a little bit of background of our relationship is he's my language teacher. So he started the Squamish language immersion program 5 years ago, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how that came to be. And yeah, he was my teacher. I went in on day one, and I didn't know any Squamish. So it's like a bit of a, we're from the same generation, but it feels like an intergenerational exchange because he is a mentor of mine. And he started the nonprofit Kuyat Stomel that I now run. Yeah, I'm like a little minion, I guess.
I mean, a little bit more than that.
Yeah. But we'll talk all about our cast, our shared project, and our relationship and how we both came to language. But that's a little bit of background about why I asked him to come and so I could pick his brain really in front of you all. I'm Squamish and Snanemoch on my father's side, Squamish Salia Joseph, and on my mother's side, I'm British and Jewish. Eve Joseph is her name. Yeah, it's wonderful. It's an invitation.
I also forgot to introduce myself. I did in the language, but in English, to translate for everybody. My name is, many people know me as Khelsilem, one of the ancestral names that I carry. I'm also Kwakwak from the Nundies people under Vancouver Island on my mother's side, and then Squamish on both my parents' sides, but grew up around the North Shore in many different Squamish communities. And then today I'm also elected councillor with the Squamish Nation. I'm the chair of our Language and Cultural Affairs Committee, so involved in language work, but at a different level, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that. And that's kind of a little bit of who I am. But we're gonna share a couple of songs to welcome you all here and share a little bit of our culture, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion, which I'm looking forward to. So the two songs that we sang, the first one is known as a snowbird song. It comes from one of our late ancestors and was remembered by some of our elders when they recorded a bunch of songs in the 1960s. And there was a handful of songs that they got together on old reel-to-reel recording device and recorded a bunch of traditional songs that they remembered from their elders. So it was kind of like our elders' generation. But that song comes from the Billy family from up Cowtain in the Squamish Valley. And then the second song is a song that was documented by one of our elders, late Uncle Louis Miranda, and was a song that's sung in one of the legends, one of our Squamish. And the song is a bit unique because we have like songs where they're used more in ceremony and our ceremonial contexts, but the second song is actually like a song that would be sung in the legend when the legend was being told. So it has a bit more of a narrative and it's mostly words and has like a lot of language to it, which we really like singing. But the other cool part of the song is that the words are talking about, it's actually a song sung from the perspective of a humpback salmon. And it's talking about, it's actually kind of gruesome. It's talking about Raven plucking out its eyes. And it's basically like saying, I'm gonna swim backwards, but then my eyes are being plucked out by Raven, and then it's saying the equivalent of saying ouch in Squamish a couple of times. So it's a kind of a neat song because it's like sung from the perspective of a character in the story, and very beautiful melody. So that was it was actually documented in like a musical notations, and then one of our friends, one of Salia's other teachers and one of my other students, he took musical studies when he was in high school, so he was actually able to like read the musical sheet so that we could learn the tune to the song, because it had the words and then it had the musical notations on it, so it was helpful in figuring out how to actually sing the song.
It was like waiting in our archives until somebody came along who could speak Squamish, who could read music and was a singer and could like transpose that. So it's a very like specific skill set, and he was the right one for the job. And so he breathed like life back into that song.
Should we take it out?
It's kind of cool.
Okay. Yeah, so that's some of those things.
Yeah.
But otherwise, we're going to talk about, I guess, just our work with the Squamish language and revitalization, and maybe we're going to start with like some of the work that we've been involved in, and then go from there.
Yeah.
And you can ask me questions. I'll ask you questions.
Yeah. So, currently I'm the executive director of Cuiatsdalno, which is a Squamish language organization. It's Squamish language and culture, but we work really closely with the Simon Fraser University on the Squamish language immersion program. And that was a program that Khelsilem brought to life about 5 years ago. And I was a student in the second year cohort. And I think I'll ask you about that after, but what's so amazing about the program is the power of immersion and what it means to go from thinking about language in a way that so many of us are brought up with in school, like a second language, like a couple hours a week, and thinking of what it means to make a sacrifice to put 40 hours a week into language, and then what it means to not translate Squamish into English to learn it. A lot of language learning is translation based, and when you take that out and you go and you learn through immersion, then instead of thinking of Squamish through an English lens and trying to push Squamish shapes through English holes, you can just let the language breathe as it is, and not think about it always through translation into your English mind, but thinking about Squamish through your Squamish brain first. And that was a leap of faith that Khelsilem took, because he was advocating for a long time, and people weren't really getting on board, and so he took it upon himself, and sometimes was teaching language that he had just learned, or going home to learn from our elders, from his late grandmother, other language speakers, going home to learn certain things and then teach it the next day. So it really is it's an amazing thing that what a leap of faith can do, and what it means to step outside of this imposter syndrome notion that we aren't ready, or we have to be fluent, or we have to be masters at something before we can believe in it. So it was a leap of faith that has just started to spread the Squamish language like wildfire. So for some context, before the language started, there was probably how many fluent to mid-level speakers do you think there were?
5?
Yeah, of a nation of around 4,000?
4,100.
4,100, pretty close. 4,100. What does it mean to have 5 speakers left of a language? And when you think about the policies, and you think about a history of colonization and ongoing relationship of colonization in this country, all of a sudden 5 seems amazing. It's extraordinary at all that anybody could have held on to something that people tried in so many ways to take from us over and over again, and still do, which we could talk a little bit about, in the lack of support that is received, or the lack of visibility that Indigenous language revitalization gets. Something that's been so targeted to have 5 people, and then to start to breathe life into the language through immersion as a result of what Khelsilem started, and his vision of immersion-based learning. After now 4 years, for what was around 5 is now closer to 50. So each year we add between 10 to 15 high-level speakers to that list of people that are protecting and advocating for this language. And then eventually, as we continue to grow as both an organization, as a community, we don't have to have only one program running at a time. We can start to have upper-level programs running simultaneously. So we're adding new people to this list of Squamish speakers, and then we're also continuing to invest in the people that we've already invested in, so that people don't plateau and we start to produce fluent speakers. It's a little bit of background and a little bit of gratitude for the vision and what it means just to move forward. Because if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? Right? So there's so many privileges that lots of us have. There's to learn certain things. There might not be a time crunch.
Maybe if you want to learn Spanish, you can do that whenever you want, and there's billions of speakers and millions of resources. Any film you want to watch, you can watch it in Spanish or French or Portuguese, and there is no time pressure. There is no who you are as a people, who you are as a culture, your capacity to pray to your ancestors, your capacity to understand your culture and to speak to the land and the language that it remembers. None of that pressure exists. So it's a really unique thing with an Indigenous language revitalization. That there isn't the time to get people to wait till one person gets fluent and have them teach. So the methodology that we use in the language program now is this idea that because time is of the essence, like literally, like there's like a forest fire behind us and we are right in front of it. We do not have time to sit and rest. We do not have time to try and teach individuals to become fluent, and then once they're fluent, they can teach. We have to just like spread the language out this way instead of going up. It's not linear and it's not hierarchical. Whatever I learn to teach it off to the people that are just coming into the program, and then they learn to teach what they're learning at the same time. So every time I learn something, it's like I'm learning it for the people around me, and I bring people's fluency up. So when you think about that fire that's like right behind our backs, instead of one person carrying all that load, we're spreading it out, and you have like people moving forward all together at the same time, and we're bringing each other up and up and up. So that's like, it's a really different type of necessity. It is around life, like it is around life and death of a language. And when you lose a language, it can be around life or death of your people. I know young people that have gone into this immersion program now who have said it has changed their life. And it certainly did for me. It gave me like a very unique sense of belonging as a Squamish person that I always like sought and didn't know how to sit in that properly. I grew up, like I'm mixed race, I'm half white, half native, and I grew up off reserve on Vancouver Island with my white mom, and trying to understand myself as a Squamish person, trying to understand where I belong and how I relate to the world and move through the world. I never felt as at home as when I sat in your classroom and started to hear about my ancestors that spoke and to hear their voices speaking, and it was so powerful that I after the first day of the language program, I just never touched a drop of alcohol again. And there's no shame, like you can, like alcohol and ceremony can, or indigeneity, everybody has their own relationship to it. But it just started to make me feel sick, because what I recognized on the first day of that program is every time I speak my language, I'm in ceremony. Every time I speak my language, I'm connected to the thousands of Squamish people that fought so hard for us to have what we have, that fought so hard to protect those 5 speakers, to protect all of Khelsilem's teachers, so that he could take that leap of faith and invest in us. When so many people told him he couldn't do it, when so many people said, "You're not ready, who are you, like, you have to get fluent before you could teach," and he just said, I have to spread this way. We can't spread this way. We have to spread the load, like vertically. And it has, as a result of that, it has been spreading and spreading, and it has changed the way that I pray and relate to my ancestors, the way that I can sit and listen to my teacher and mentor and friend speak to you all and understand what he's saying. And I used to long for that. I used to long for home. I used to long to understand who I was and how I belonged. And then it's those moments when you have somebody that I've always looked up to speaking and addressing you all, and I can pick up on every word. It's those moments that you find yourself belonging, and you find yourself exactly where you're supposed to be and why you're supposed to be there. And language has been that gift for me, to feel comfortable in my own skin and to feel like just immense gratitude for to be Squamish and to be surrounded by by brave, generous people who are are willing to take risks and to assert our birthrights, to say this is ours, this is has always been ours. You've tried to take it from us, but you can't take it. And now you can help and watch me as I pass it down to the next generation, because this is our birthright. And that's the assertion that I see every day with my team showing up 40 hours a week, 8-hour long Zoom days. That's our assertion, and that's what keeps us going. And it's such an amazing thing to be a part of. And that's where my language journey started. I went in on that first day of Khelsilem's class, and I knew zero Squamish. I didn't grow up hearing it. I didn't, even in our, like in the Vancouver school systems, there are some Squamish teachers, but I grew up on the island, right? So that's where my language journey started. But my journey for understanding where I belonged and who I was as a Squamish person started from day one, and that's where a real turning point happened for me. But I think it would be great to hear about where your language journey started, because that's my origin story as to where I came to language. But I'm sure that people would love to hear more about yours.
I did not grow up Squamish is my second language. I really started learning it when I was around 22, 23, so about almost 10 years ago. And then was doing immersion with a fluent speaker, one of our other teachers, elder in our community, and did like a lot of mentor-apprentice, which is a method for language acquisition, and you basically spend it's like a goal of 12 and a half hours a week. And I got to a level of proficiency in the language where I was just actually I couldn't get farther because I didn't have enough people to talk to. And I was quite stuck. And so I realized the only way I'm going to get better in the language is actually to create more speakers who know everything that I know, so then we can talk to each other, and then we'll both get better in the language. And so I had been wanting to do kind of an adult immersion program. I had learned about it from my friend Dakota Brandt from Oswego, Six Nations, where they had an adult immersion program that they've been running. I think now they're in their 20th or 21st year. So a long history of doing adult immersion programs. They run a 3-year program, and they go from September to the end of May, I believe. About 20 students per year kind of thing. So I modeled after that program, and then started it with the first cohort, and then slowly started building the number of speakers. And then because I was teaching it and creating more speakers, my proficiency did go up like I wanted it to, because I had more people to talk to. There was more language I needed to learn, because my students would ask me a question about how do I say this, and I'd be like, I'm going to teach you that later. They did not know. I did not know the answer at that time. They didn't find out until a couple years later that every time I said later, I was actually because I had to go and find out. But yeah, and so worked in the program for 2 years. I built it, got it up and running, ran 2 cohorts, and then I actually ran for council with Squamish and got elected, and that became a bit of a it is a full-time position. And I had trained 2 of my students from the first cohort to be my TAs in the second year, so by the 3rd year, they kind of took over running the program. And they're running it now with Salia and a few others who have all kind of gone through the program. But there are students in the program, even last year, that I don't know that well. I see them sometimes and I'll say hi, but I actually don't know them at all. But they speak fantastic Squamish, and we'll chat, and sometimes I remember about a year ago, so some of the students ran into me in Vancouver. They were out on a field trip or something, and they just happened to bump into me, and they started talking to me in the language, and some of the students were like, who was that? And there are people you don't know who Khelsilem is? And I'm like, no. And they're halfway through the year, and so there's kind of if we think about it in generations and years and stuff, there's a language family growing, and a tribe of speakers growing, and continues to grow. So that's been a little bit of my journey and I actually have stepped away from learning Squamish because it's kind of thriving with the people that are running it, and I started to work on learning my grandmother's. I come from two Indigenous people, so I'm trying to learn my grandmother's language on my mom's side, which is Kwakala. So I'm like starting that now, and helping a community up there kind of replicate the same program we did with Squamish, but take the same idea but do it with another Indigenous language. And yeah, so that's kind of my little story with it. And I miss it dearly. I don't get to speak as much as I used to, and my proficiency I think is lagging a little bit. I'm more involved on the policy side with the Squamish Nation now in the council level, so advocating for increased budgets and funding for language work. We're developing a Squamish language revitalization and maintenance policy, which is like kind of the equivalent of developing our own legislation for the Squamish Nation around language, which we're close to bringing back to council and start implementing. And we're starting to look at developing like an official language strategy for the nation that will be kind of holistic and all-encompassing for the ways that we want to activate every part of the nation, from the community groups to the different departments to the different organizations that work in the community. Like, how can everybody activate themselves to participate in language work? And one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got was when I went to New Zealand about almost 6 years ago, or I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, was this kind of philosophy that they had, which I think is really encouraging, that they said, every word that you learn and you go out and find and learn how to say it, word or sentence, grammar piece, and then you use that with, say, like, your nieces and nephews or your grandchildren or your children, depending on the context, and you use it with them so that they learn it without having to go and translate or go out and find it. It's actually brought to them. That's one word that they don't have to go and find. So it doesn't have to be, there isn't just like one way to participate in the work. Everybody can have a role. Not all the roles don't even have to involve learning the language. There's other roles that are really important too. So it's just that I think for our community, given the context that we're in, focusing on adult acquisition for a younger adult generation is key and integral to then moving on to the next steps of the revitalization, because we need an adult generation of speakers in order to expand the types of offerings that we would do for the rest of the community. So if we want to do more things, we actually need an adult generation that is quite proficient in the language, and we need to create it quite rapidly. So, if we had like 150 or 250 adult speakers between the ages of 18 and 35, now we can start doing a whole bunch of different things that are then going to have a compounding effect. So it's, instead of doing like additions where one speaker creates one speaker, we're actually doing one speaker creates 15 and 15 create 80 and 80 creates 1,000 and 1,000 creates 10,000 kind of thing. So, but there's a long way to go. There's still a lot more to do, but it has a huge potential to accomplish many things. And I think the main message that I often have to answer to people is why revitalize these Indigenous languages, which is not, I think, an unreasonable question. I think people ask that from a genuine curiosity, or it's a logical question in some ways. The interesting thing about that question is it depends who's asking, because I think for a lot of our elders, and this was documented through some of the research that was done with them, the language actually wasn't really what they were concerned about. The language was actually the tool you use to access what they really cared about. They were concerned that our people were becoming, that they weren't like our ancestors that they knew, that our people were becoming unkind to each other, that they weren't taking care of each other, that our people had become very hurtful and mean to each other as a people. And our elders had talked about that. Their elders and our ancestors were very kind and very compassionate and very giving. and were raised to treat each other, what they would say, properly, and to be a good person. And so, they would talk about that. One of the things that they felt was that because the language had declined, our people had lost some of the ability to be like our ancestors in terms of being that kind of kindness to each other. And so they wanted the language to come back because it would bring back a way of life for our people. And I would say that I don't have any research, a compendium of research that confirms that that's the case, but definitely within our community, I see it happening in the way that there is a reverence for the language, there is a type of respect for the language, that the people who speak the language are learning to live these values and to walk the talk around that. And as it continues to expand, it'll continue to transform our people in terms of who they're known for.
Yeah, I think that's it's an important note to think about, is that like decolonization is not like a metaphor, or like it's Native people get so like compartmentalized in our society, right? And so like when I talk to natives from the States, there's this idea like, oh well, like we're invisible there, but you guys, like you're so visible in BC, or like your art is everywhere, and like that must be so great for you. But I think there's like a phenomenon that is so ever present with that hyper visibility of our cultures as Native people. Not only do we get like homogenized, but people select certain aspects of what they like about Indigenous people. So not unlike appropriation of so many other cultures, but there's certain aspects that people just like deem palatable. So they might, like there's lots of people that like to hang our art on their walls, or they like to see us dance. They might even love to hear the sounds and the reverberations of our language. But then we lose people when we get to conversations about land, or we lose people when we get to conversations about colonization or politics, right? So there's aspects of our people that they like, and then aspects that they're not here for. We lose people at constantly. So one of the real losses of being hyper visible as Indigenous people in BC in particular is that it creates this like post-colonial idea that like we just live in perfect harmony together, or that there's like perfect respect between like settler populations and Indigenous populations. But that's a really dangerous story to tell, because it doesn't actually tell the right story. It doesn't get to the actual work that's being done by our communities to fight every single day for our birthrights and for what our ancestors gave us. And it doesn't talk about what we're up against. It doesn't talk about the various ways that our people receive like colonial violence and oppression in all aspects of Canadian society. So we can't have that conversation about language revitalization and the value of it without talking about what we're up against and what the stakes are if we don't have it. So when people say decolonization is not a metaphor, what they mean is like we can't just talk about language revitalization, we can't just talk about cultural revitalization, all these words, all these buzzwords, without really talking about what they mean. And so I think like what I think is so important about what Khelsilem was saying is why learn the language is because it teaches us who we are and how we relate to each other. And you can't lose that. It's not just like it's nice to learn your language. It's not just a pastime or a hobby of mine. I haven't chosen this line of work because it's like extracurricular. You know, it is integral to who we are. And if you lose how you care for one another, if you lose how you care for the land, if you lose how you care for your kin and how you speak to your ancestors, if that's gone, what is there? Who are you? You know, and it honestly does save lives. It creates connection and kinship to each other, and it gives people purpose and direction, and we learn how to hold each other up because just as I was saying earlier, the way that we learn, we're not translating everything to English. We can't think of ourselves as Squamish people. We can't think of ourselves as anything else first and then Squamish. We have to think of ourselves as Squamish first. We have to like close our eyes and look past the noise and the cars and the buildings of this city and remember that we've been here for forever. To remember that not so long ago our ancestors were speaking this language first, and we're caring for this place, and they left us all the tools to be sustainable forever in the way that we care for the land, the way that we raise our children and care for each other. They left us all those tools, but the tools are in Squamish, so we can't get those tools fully unless we learn to understand them. And of course, the question, if it's like you said, it depends who asks the question about why language, because maybe it's an Indigenous person that's asking you that question, because just as we can be sitting here talking about how language saves lives, this could easily be a panel on ethnobotany, on traditional plants, or this could be a panel on there's so many different aspects of who we are, of birth work, or of like sports and physical activity, or around queerness, or around like sexuality. There's so many aspects of who we are as community members that resonate with certain people, and they dedicate their life's work to it because it is around life or death. So there's so many aspects around who we are that are so important, and there's lots of people that can't focus all their time on language because they're too busy doing something else that is so important. So it's not a hierarchical triangle of needs around what we fight for. It's just sometimes you walk into a class one day thinking you're going to do Squamish for 9 months and then go on to do something else, and then here you are 4 years later talking about how it's changed your life and what your goals and dreams are for the language. So I think if there are any takeaways for non-Indigenous people in the audience or people that are listening, I think it's around like when you hear things around decolonization, or you hear things around language revitalization, like really diving deep into what that means and why did you have to revitalize it, or why was it taken away, or really understanding the origin stories of where we got to where we are now. So I shared a little bit about myself, and you shared a little bit about yourself, but there's so much more work to do to understand how, like, all of the other moving pieces as to how we got here and why. And that's a way that we can all engage with language revitalization, and why it's important, or where we all sit in that. What are our stakes in that? What are our obligations, or how do we witness that and carry that? Because it's something that's happening all around us, And I was speaking on a panel not too long ago with Deborah Sparrow from Musqueam and Shar Alec George from Tsleil-Waututh, and I did my opening in Squamish. And then she said, after I spoke, she's like, I just want to think about the language in such reverence, because my mother came from a generation of people that had nails put through her tongue in residential school when they would try and speak. So, and that's just one of many stories, or that's one of many obstacles of how our language was criminalized and made illegal. And that's just one aspect of why there's 5 speakers at that one point. That's just one aspect in when you think of the hourglass of all of the ancestors and all that sand that came down to that little tiny opening that is now starting to grow that way. That nail through the tongue is just one story of how those granules of sand got so small. And so, if there's anything I can try and relay, it's just deep reverence for any type of advocacy for our identities as Indigenous people and the work that goes into holding on to something that's important and then deciding to grow it. And so it's nice for me because even hearing Khelsilem talk, he's so matter of fact, and he's so very like logistical. Even when you list off your numbers and you list off your statistics, I'm glad that I could be here to say how much I appreciate the risk you took and the leap of faith, because you really, in that hourglass, you push those walls back so that that sand can fall quicker and we can just grow that much quicker. And I know you see it as just something you did a few years ago, but it is honestly, it is a machine, a well-oiled machine. It feels like at this point, in terms of people's interest, in terms of having that seed planted, and then comes the advocacy work and the trying to make sure we have jobs and trying to make sure we have infrastructure, and that's where I come in, to that advocacy side of trying to sustain and grow these seeds that were planted. And we make a good team, but I'm really glad that I could share some of my thoughts around how much I honor that work that was done and the opportunity that I got to sit in that language program and to watch it change people's lives around me. And to think about that with such reverence. Because it's when I speak my language, sometimes it brings pride and joy to our people, and sometimes it brings up grief and resentment and sadness because it's something that so many people didn't get. It's also something that people were told for generations, that you are backwards, you are stupid, you are dumb for speaking it. You won't get anywhere with that, who you are is backwards, who you are is savage, So when you told a story over and over again, it's easy to internalize that and to look in on yourself and to think that's who you are. And then it takes starting to think about looking at yourself through a Squamish lens, thinking about looking at yourself through Squamish words first to start to undo that. But there is still so much grief and sadness in our community for a birthright that so many people will never have the opportunity to reclaim. And so it's with that deep sense of responsibility and reverence that we have to hold, because we have something that so many people never had the opportunity to have. But with that, we can give that opportunity to people that otherwise would never have had it, and start to create eventually more first language speakers, because our last first language speaker passed away last spring.
This spring.
Yeah, this past spring. So that means on this earth there's no longer a first language Squamish speaker. No longer anybody that spoke Squamish first and then learned English later. We only have second language speakers now, but because of the people that worked really damn hard to preserve what they could, and because of at that time just a young man who started a immersion program at SFU even though people told him not to, and now with our 50, 60, 70 people on the go, there's the potential there to raise new first language speakers. And to me that is just such a joy and such an immense accomplishment, because there were never supposed to be any of us left at all. We were never supposed to be sitting with each other. There was never supposed to be weavers anymore that knew how to work with wool, that knew how to make drums, that knew how to sing our songs. None of that was ever in the plans from this country and this state. So the fact that we're here and speaking to each other and celebrating with you it's a really amazing thing that I have a lot of reverence for and gratitude for.
So one of the motivations for me was that a very long time ago I had this question posed to me that I always really loved, which was, how do you contribute to the things you complain about or want to see changed? And the thing about that question is that once you figure out the answer, it requires you to do something. And I often had this metaphor in my head that there's the people who are chopping wood, then there's the people who are standing over there telling you how you're doing it wrong, and then there's the people who will get in there and help you chop wood. And I personally, for me, never had time, or I've never had any interest in being somebody who was just going to tell people how to chop wood and stand on the side and not do the work, because the wood needs to be chopped. Winter's coming, as they say in Game of Thrones. So I was just always motivated to get the work done, and I knew that there was others that wanted to do the work too. And I think what was so much fun about it was just, to have our elders really smile and feel happy that the language was being spoken again. A bunch of our elders passed away in the last 2.5 years. Like, a lot of the last speakers are really gone in the last 2.5 years, and we got to spend a little bit of time before they passed, and I know a few of them were quite just elated at the work that was happening, and a bunch of their grandkids and great grandkids were in the program, and my grandmother, who was a bit of a silent speaker who spoke the language till she was about 6 or 7, and then kind of didn't get it spoken to her much after that, but still remembered quite a bit. So I think that was a big motivation for it. And then it was just, if you want to make your ancestors smile, speak your language. But it's cool. It's fun. It's also just, I know for me, and I think for a lot of young Indigenous people, that feeling of, I remember for me, one of my earliest memories was being on a bus in Vancouver and hearing people speak Chinese to each other. And I thought, well, that's cool, they have a language, they can talk to each other, nobody else understands them, I don't understand them. And then I would hear sometimes their elders speak, and I'd be like, oh, that's so cool, they have their own little code language and nobody else can speak. And so, it was, I think for me, my earliest dream around language was wanting to have a secret language that very few people understood so we could talk to each other. And we got there. I mean, we get there, we're there now. We can go on a bus and talk about people on the bus that they don't know we're talking about them. Or we often talk online, because so much of our language use is actually on Facebook and stuff like that. So we can post on Facebook and we'll kind of respond to each other and tease each other, and nobody really knows what we're saying. But that's part of the living language, is that it's alive like that as well. So, yeah.
I'm sure there's questions, so maybe we should.
I just want to first apologize, because I'm probably going to have to leave before you actually answer the question. I have to get back to my kids in Surrey. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your regalia and the significance of wearing blankets to do this work.
This was woven by my. Oh yeah. Because I'll tell you on the video. Yeah. It was woven by my auntie Joy Joseph, and she's the matriarch of our family. And it has one of our family's designs on it that denotes my dad's ancestral name. I also have it tattooed on my arm. And she made it for me when I graduated from UBC in Critical Indigenous Studies. And it's a part of our ancestral regalia. It was traditionally woven with mountain goat wool and with the Salish woolly dog hair. So there used to be a type of dog on the west coast, the Salish woolly dog, and it had really long hair. And it's extinct now, but when you see photos of our ancestors, wool was a high honor. It took unbelievably a lot of work to make them ancestrally, and they would dye with plant dyes and have these big amazing looms, and people will have designs that they come from, or have different types of regalia that they come from in their family, and so our family comes from wool.
Ditto. I'm just kidding. Yeah, this one was made by a weaver in my community, and I got it given to me when I received my ancestral name 7 years ago or something. But The wool ones that are made with the mountain goat wool, like mountain goat wool is also like a prized commodity, highly very precious, and often came with a level of protection, I guess, like spiritual protection for the people wearing it. So most of the blankets now, because it's so hard to get wool, and there's like there's somewhat hunting restrictions on hunting mountain goat. So there's very rarely do you see like a mountain goat wool blanket anymore. There's less population too, so for conservation purposes and things like that, they're mostly made with like alpaca wool or sheep's wool and things like that. But the patterns and the techniques are still the same.
Jordy, you had a question?
Yeah, I wondered if you know the word for the Salish woolly dog, like in the language.
Good question. I don't actually know. Do you?
Give me a sec.
Cover that one later.
Yeah.
It's in there somewhere.
Steno is, I think, the hunting dog, and Smite was a general term for dog, and then no, I don't remember it right now.
We'll get back to you.
I don't use it that often.
Yeah. We just say to people when we have to think on it, like tuch ak. So we'll tuch ak you, Jordy, and we'll message you on Instagram. I think it's like what's so starking to me, or it's like when you think about a language and you think about it needing to be living, it needs to be usable. So in order for it to be usable, you have to have words for cell phone and computer, or things that we didn't have pre-contact. And when you think about where our language got hit so hard is like at contact, right? And then proceeds to get hit over and over and over again. But lots of our vocabulary, a lot of it's pre-contact vocabulary. So it's such an important question about, well, how do you make an ancestral language a current language that you can use every day? Because if we can only talk in the context of ceremony, then our language doesn't stand a chance. What are some like thoughts or processes that came to you when trying to teach it as a living language?
Some of that is addressed by the fact that younger speakers will inherently like invent new words. Like it just happens. I think if we had first language speakers, and we almost do right now, like those kids are just going to create new words. Mm-hmm. You can't stop them. Mm-hmm. And so that's going to happen naturally. Mm-hmm. I think what the risk is, or what the advice is that there's a American sociolinguist named Joshua Fishman who talks about this, and he talks about the importance of what he calls functional specificity. That when you're doing what he called reversing language shift, so this idea that a language was inclining in growth, up until 1781, the number of Squamish speakers had theoretically always been growing, like year over year. And then smallpox hits for the first time in the 1870s, and then it declines. And then by the 1900s, after influenza and smallpox again, and Spanish flu and tuberculosis, and then the prevalence of the English language and then residential schools, you just get this decline. So he talks about an incline, or reversing that shift of a decline into an incline again. But he talks about that in that reversing language shift, that functional specificity is recognizing that different languages perform certain functions better than the others. And so when you're revitalizing a language to create relevancy, it doesn't actually make much sense to try and take one language that performs a certain function really well and try to make that language then perform this function that the other language you already have access to does. So there's not a lot of benefit to, say, taking a language like Squamish and trying to modernize it so that we can do audited financial statements in the Squamish language. Like, it's just not going to be that functional for us. But if we wanted to talk about how to raise our children to be Squamish, then Squamish actually performs that function quite well, because we've been doing that, and it already has the vocabulary for it and the vernacular for it and all that kind of stuff. But then, it's easy. Like, then you can think about like new words you need to create. So things like put on your seatbelt, which didn't exist until a few years ago. Or like change a diaper, which didn't exist until a few years ago. Things like that. So those you're just creating relevancy in areas where there is a need for relevancy, and then just ignoring the places that there's not a lot of relevancy in. Eventually you'll get there, but it's just not the focus right now. Strategically, it doesn't make sense.
But colloquial, sort of like just chatting, is really important because that's going to be what you're using the most with people. And so having, like, creating the language so that you can do that, to cover enough bases that you can talk casually about your everyday, is really important. And then when you create a word, like it still follows a Squamish recipe, and it, like, there are ways, just like in any language, to create new words with certain suffixes and certain, like, roots and bases, and it does use, like, it's like the math of a language to create a new. It's not just like totally arbitrary, you know. It all makes sense with how our language is formed.
There's Joshua Fishman calls it like the Big Brother language, whatever that dominant language is, because it's not always English, depending on the context. And there's places in the world where it's not English. Sometimes it's Spanish. Sometimes it changes from context to context. But talks about the Big Brother language and the influence of it and the pressure of it. We have a lot of loan words in Squamish from, like, the turn of the century, like a lot of French and English words that are borrowed. But we're also, like, more so creating new words that are rooted in the grammatical structure or the linguistic structure of the language now. So, you know, we have a suffix for face, and then we have a transliterated word for book, which is poke, which sounds like book. But then you put the suffix for face on poke, and you get Facebook. And so we call it pokos when we talk about Facebook. And there's some social medias that we've started to create words for, and some we haven't, because not everybody's on MySpace anymore. But it just happens, and it happens naturally. And there's other stuff. That's, like, I would say, like, the surface level stuff. There's, like, more complex stuff. Actually, a good example of one, we went through an exercise of creating names for all of the departments in the Squamish Nation. So we have, like, the lands department and the health department and child and family services department and the rights and title department. So we have all these departments, and only a couple of the departments had names. So we had to come up with names for all of them as a part of a brand relaunch. And so we got to the discussion around, like, what are we going to call council, the elected council? Because we didn't have a word for council, we don't have a word for councillors because we didn't have those things. We don't have a word for democracy, for example, yet. But we were like, what do we call council? And so then the name that the group of speakers ended up coming up with, which was Nuknewintum ta Ohomeo, which is, like, always being advised by the people, is basically the concept. So what is council? What is the elected leadership? They're always being told what to do by the people, or advised. Told what to do is probably a little bit more accurate. Speaking as an elected official. But it was just like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And that's a very kind of Squamish way of thinking about that role. You know, there's other ways you could define it, like those who are in charge, and it's like, no, that's not actually what the role's supposed to be. It actually is more like this. So we accomplish those things in other ways, which is always fun.
We do have quite a few words. I'm like, that's just French, but we use it now. We have, so it's like, well, you just roll with it.
Yeah.
And that's you're Squamish now.
I think it's really interesting because your description right there really helps define Squamish as a kind of verb-based or action language, which I think is the big difference between English, which is very noun-based, right? You know, so. And I find many indigenous languages are that way, which makes you look at the world in a very different way because you're looking at it as always in action.
Apparently most languages are actually like that. It's actually English that's unique in that way, but most languages, not just indigenous languages, but a lot of languages are structured that way. And there's also some languages that are actually structured around adjectives, not verbs. I was reading about some languages in Central America and stuff like that. They're kind of structured that way. So.
I'm sure there's other questions, but I did want to, one of the things I've always found so impressive about your program is that, speaking about action, is you really learn language from doing. I know that was doing things like hide tanning and weaving and activities, and that you would gather together and through doing be also learning and conversing. So it's not so much sitting in a classroom memorizing.
Yeah, I mean, that's, which I think taps into the idea that, like, as I was saying before, this could be a panel on so many different aspects of our culture around why it's important and why we think it is worth our life's work or whatever. But I think that just touches on how you can't really separate language from any of those other things. Like, it's all so interconnected and like intersectional in our communities. So exactly, we can't so much learn from a book when there's so many different ways you can tie it into the other parts of who we are to learn just that much better, for sure. Our immersion program, which has just started last week. Normally we do, like, we've been doing the first year for the last 4 years, and then now we've started like a second year, so we can go back and collect the people with whom we've gotten kind of, if this is beginner and this is fluent, the people we've gotten to like here, we've gone back to try and bring them up to here, as opposed to continuing to create more people that are here. So we've just started that program, and normally we were in a language house at Salia Joseph, but because of COVID, we are doing it all, virtually on Zoom. So what I failed to mention is that we use a language methodology called Where Are Your Keys, which if you like want to write a note to yourself or something, it's something to definitely check out. It's an amazing methodology, and it was created on the understanding that you don't have the time to get one person fluent and have them teach through translation. You just don't, or your language could die in that time. It's the idea that you have to create many speakers at once to teach one another what you learn, and that you can teach before you're fluent, which is what Khelsilem did. And so we use that methodology, and we just do it online the best we can. We try, like, luckily the two creators of the methodology are really organized, and they create our schedule when we're all together in the house. So on Zoom, we just try and emulate it the best we can, but we're not singing together, we're not cooking together. It's like, it's really hard. It's super hard.
And how many people are in the group? 10?
I think there's 15 students in the diploma program, and then there's a lot of teachers, because where I come in is we get these people that have gone through the program, and then they're like, okay, well, where do I go now? Because it's not like you're the people that are doing Squamish, and this is the skill that I've just learned, and if I want to keep in that world, what do I do? And I'm like, I will find you money so that I can hire you, because we just want to keep people coming back and then teaching. And the idea is that, like, they're teaching the first year, but they're still surrounded by people that speak more than them, and then they're teaching what they know to people that speak less, and we're just slowly bringing each other up and up and up. So that's where I come in, just trying to hustle funds to keep more people in the room.
Khelsilem has to go because he has other commitments. He's a very busy guy, so we're so lucky that he was here to join us today. And I'd like to just say thank you to both of you for taking the time and sharing so much. I'm sure there's other questions in the room. I don't know, Salia, if you have to run, if you've got a few minutes to answer a few more questions or chat with people, but thank you to you both. And this presentation is being recorded. I should have reminded people at the beginning, but we will have it available on our website for reviewing, so you can come back and listen to it all again and share it with other people. And I think of language as sort of the keystone of every culture, right? And I think without the language, a lot of other things don't fall into place. I think you described that beautifully, and I think it's one of the things that residential schools really hit hard on the language for a reason, and because they were trying to destroy. And so thank you for doing all the amazing work you do. It's really, I heard Khelsilem speak 5 years ago, and it was just a dream at that point. And so it's so great to see where it is now. Yeah. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, listen.
Thank you.